reviewing the Nikon 50mm f1.4 AI lens. A quick overview of what the video is going to be about. We're going to talk about the history of the lens. We're going to talk about the applications a 50mm lens is good at. We're going to talk about its specs. We're going to talk about its build quality. We're going to do a focus breathing test. We're going to do a hard light test. And we're going to do a soft light test. And we're going to do a macro close focusing test. We're going to test for vignetting and distortion. We're going to test for longitudinal chromatic aberration. We're going to talk about the lens's flaring characteristics and its chromatic aberration. We're going to talk about its bokeh. And we're going to talk value. This was a lens used from everyone from photojournalists to any manner of working pros to the amateur and hobbyist of enthusiasts. A bit of history about the lens. My version of the Nikon 50mm f1.4 IS dates from 1970 to 1981. The forks on the side lens are used for metering with our old film cameras. For back in the day when lenses didn't have any electronic communication between the camera and lens. Note, this will fit on a Nikon DSLR without an adapter. However, it is not compatible with certain Nikon cameras. You're going to have to check. However, it is backwards compatible with any mirrorless system with a proper adapter, like a Nikon Z or a Sony A7 like I have right here, which I'm conducting this review with. The focal length is great for portraits, landscapes, still lifes, and low light. Blow out the background, compress it slightly, and give a nice emphasis on your subject. This is wonderful for doing still lifes. The fast maximum aperture allows you to shoot in very low light situations and keeping your ISO low. You wouldn't think a lot of depth of field would be useful in a landscape, but sometimes you don't want to have that many things in focus in your landscape, and a 50mm is great for that. You can stop it down to get more depth of field, or leave it wide open to have lots. Now to talk about this lens's specs. The lens filter thread is 52mm. The lens has 7 aperture blades. The lens is 9 ounces or 255 grams. The minimum focusing distance of this lens is 1 foot 5 inches. In metric, that's 0.318 millimeters. The build quality. The lens is made out of metal with a rubber focusing ring. It was a professional lens back in the day after all. Unfortunately, the lens, however, does not have a rather shearing gasket, as you can see here. It is a clicking aperture ring, not clickless. Bad news for filmmakers. The focusing ring turns smoothly, but I personally prefer my focusing rings to be stiffer. And as you can see, the front element moves in and out as you focus. Bad for people who are using polarizers. As you can see, the lens does suffer from focus breathing. As you focus, you can see it zooming in and out. Let's move on to the hard light test. Lenses tend to perform better in a hard, direct, contrasting light. Let's see how it does in the hard light. Now add f1.4 moving into the center of the image. We shoot good sharpness and contrast, even wide open at f1.4. Now let's have a look at the corners. Things look fantastic in the corners. Now moving on to f2. Looking into the center of the image, we see a boost in sharpness and contrast. Now, how about those corners? There's also a bump in sharpness and resolution in the corners. Excellent. Moving on to f2.8. Looking into the center of the image, we see another jump in sharpness and contrast. Let's have a look at the corners. And the corners look fantastic. Now, moving on to f4. Looking into the center of the image, things look fantastic. Other jump in sharpness and contrast. Let's have a look at the corners. Things also look fantastic. Moving on to f5.6. In the center of the image, we see another boost in sharpness and contrast. Excellent. Now how about the corner? We see another jump in resolution in the corners. Very good. Moving on to f8. In the center of the image, things look fantastic. Now let's have a look at the corners. Corners also look fantastic. Excellent result. Moving on to f11. Moving into the center of the image, we are starting to see some signs of diffraction, but image quality still looks excellent. How about the corners? The corners still look pretty good. Moving on to the minimum aperture of f16. Looking into the center of the image, we are definitely noticing the signs of diffraction. A definite loss in sharpness and contrast, but the image quality does look good overall. Excellent. How about the corners? The corners also look good considering how far sharp down we are. Good. This lens test is going to occur in a low light environment with low contrast. Most lenses will perform good in bright, hard, contrasty light. But we're not going to be shooting in that a lot of the time, especially if we're interested in good photos, and especially when we have a lens with a fast maximum aperture like this one does. So let's see how it does in the low light. At f1.4, moving into the center of the image, we do see a lack of sharpness and contrast. Moving into the corners don't look so great, but not bad considering that this is a low light shot, wide open at f1.4. But not bad considering that this is a low light shot, wide open at f1.4. Now moving on to f2. Moving into the center of the image, we do see a boost in sharpness and contrast is stopped down to f2. Excellent. Let's have a look at the corners. The corners look slightly better, but not by much. Pretty good result considering. Moving on to f2.8. Moving into the center of the image, we see an excellent boost in sharpness and contrast step down to f2.8. Let's have a look at the corners. The corners are starting to look much better. It's only the very extreme corners that still have a bit of softness to them. Excellent result. Now, moving on to f4. Moving into the center of the image, Well, things look excellent. Image quality is just, well, perfect. How about we have a look at the corners now? Well, the corners look fantastic. However, there is a hint of softness in the very edges of the frame. Moving on to f5.6. Moving into the center of the image, we see a boost in contrast, but sharpness looks about the same. How about those corners? The corners also look pretty good. Excellent. Moving on to f8. Moving into the center of the image, we are starting to notice the signs of diffraction. There is a loss to contrast, but sharpness still looks pretty good. How about the corners? A lack of contrast in the corners, but the corners look decently sharp considering. Moving on to f11. Moving in the center of the image, things look about the same as f8. Lack of contrast, but still sharp. How about the corners? The corners look okay. Finally, moving on to f16 at the minimum aperture. Moving into the center of the image, we're starting to notice a lack of sharpness now and the lack of contrast from before. Not bad. How about those corners? The corners look about the same as the center. It's an okay result. Time for the macro close focusing test. At f1.4, the depth of field is really shallow, but if you look right there, you can see good image quality. At f2, we see much more sharpness, and we gain much more depth of field. Stop down this to f2. Image quality looks good. At f2.8, we see other jump in sharpness and depth of field. Image quality still looks great. At f4, moving into the center of the image, we see another jump in sharpness and contrast. Excellent. At f5.6, moving into the center of the image, we see another jump in sharpness and contrast. Excellent. Excellent result. Moving on to f8. Looking into the center of the image, things look about the same as f5.6. Moving on to f11. Moving into the center of the image, we see another jump in sharpness and contrast. Excellent result. In course of improvement in depth of field stop down. Finally, we stopped all the way down to f16. Moving into the center of the image, we are starting to notice some signs of diffraction, but this is still fantastic image quality. Stop down all the way to f16. Excellent. Time to test lens distortion and vignetting with my custom lens distortion and vignetting chart. At f1.4, we see quite a lot of vignetting and barrel distortion. At f2, we still see quite strong vignetting, but it is already quite reduced. Now, at f2.8, we see other reduction and vignetting. At f4, the vignetting is gone. Now to the longitudinal chromatic aberration test. At f1.4, we see minor longitudinal chromatic aberration at f1.4. At f2, we still see minor longitudinal chromatic aberration. Moving on to f2.8. We still see minor longitudinal chromatic aberration. At f4, we still see a smidge of longitudinal chromatic aberration, but it's pretty much gone. At f5.6, the longitudinal chromatic aberration is almost gone. It's very faint. At f8, we still see faint signs of longitudinal chromatic aberration. Now finally at f11, well, the longitudinal chromatic aberrations are gone. Good. Time to talk about the flaring. As you can see, this lens in artificial light gives off a ton of flare. And as you can see on the car lights, it gives off a lot of chromatic aberration around those bright highlight points. Yeah, it tends to mirror whatever artificial lights happen to be around. But if you're photographing out in nature and not in cities like this, its flaring really isn't that big of a deal. Neither is its chromatic aberration. To show you some more examples of flaring, I'm going to grab my Lume Cube Mini. And we're going to be looking at my curios on my dresser shelf for this test. You can see here when you put a artificial light source like my Lume Cube Mini, you are seeing flaring. And as you can see, it's mimicking the light pattern of the LED panel. We are noticing a loss of contrast when a light source like that enters the frame, but not that bad considering. This is an extreme test though. Usually if you're outside, this is not something I find myself noticing to be a problem. But just keep this in mind if you decide to get one of these. Note that sometimes this flaring can be quite cool in certain applications. We are returning to my curios on my dresser to test this lens's bokeh. I picked my curio because it's a complicated background. Most lenses will deliver nice smooth bokeh on a simple background. But let's see how it does on a really complicated one. Starting at f1.4, on the edges here we do see some hardness. It's pretty nice looking bokeh considering how complicated the background is. As you can see when you stop down the background, this gets busy. One more thing to note about the bokeh. Due to the fact that when you stop down, the aperture blades aren't perfectly round, you're going to notice hexagonal bokeh balls instead of round bokeh balls. There's something to keep in mind. In low light, its image quality is a little lacking. Its vignetting is average for 50mm in its class. But overall, it is a fantastic lens, and I do recommend it.